Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Thank you for joining us to this webinar. And this webinar will be about digitally enhanced learning and teaching and curriculum and assessment. I'm really glad to welcome you here. Before starting with introducing our speakers and also a little bit to the topic, I just would like to introduce you to a few technicalities and let's say etiquette for this webinar. Most of them you already know them, I'm sure, because you already have attended some webinars, but just a reminder would be useful. So on the right side of your screen, you would see three tabs. One is called chat, the other one is called Q&A, and the third one is called handouts. And the handouts, you will find a document that is our Thematic Peer Group report on the topic, and that you can also read at your pace and at ease at home. Under the chat box, this is the box where you can send your greetings to everybody attending, but you can also comment there, and you can also send us questions there if you have any technical issue, and if you have any technicality related question to ask, and we have a team here who will be happy to help. Hello, Mustafa. Good afternoon from Turkey. So here is the first message in the chat box. So please, please continue and go on with feeding it. And the third tab, sorry, is Q&A. It's the tab in the middle. And as the name says, Q&A is for questions that you would have for our speakers in the course of this webinar. So please use the Q&A box if you have any question that relates to presentations and what we will be talking about. This box is moderated, so if you don't see a question popping up immediately after you pressed enter, it's normal. There is no need to resend it. It's moderated by a colleague, and the questions will appear as they come in. So this was the technical part. I just need to still mention that the webinar is being recorded like many of EUA webinars, and you will find a recording also available afterwards on the EUA YouTube channel, and you will receive a link to the recording. All right, so that was the technical part that needed to be mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. And now, without further ado, I think we will start with the conversation itself, let's say. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Thérèse Zhang, and I'm the Deputy Director for the Higher Education Policy Unit at the European University Association. I see a few familiar names in the chat box already, so hello to all of you, and nice to have you again for this discussion on learning and teaching in the European higher education area. So I will first say a few words about the context of this webinar and the topic, and then I will introduce our speakers, and then I will make myself a bit more discreet because the floor will be there. So of course, trying with the slides. So this webinar is entitled Embedding Digitally Enhanced Learning and Teaching into Curriculum and Assessment. And it will mostly propose to a presentation of the reports that we put together in the framework of what we call thematic peer groups. And these thematic peer groups took place in the course of 2021, in the framework of the DIGI HE project that EUA is coordinating, but also coordinating in a partnership with a series of institutions, organizations, and you see them listed on the right side of the slide. This project is a 3-year project funded by the Erasmus Plus program, and the objectives are to encourage self-reflection on digitally enhanced learning and teaching at European higher education institutions, and also strengthening strategic approaches to DELT and capacity building at institutions. It actually started right before the pandemic, so we actually planned it at the beginning independently of the pandemic, but then it turned out, of course, that the project acted as a catalyst also for further reflecting, but also for engaging with institutions regarding digitally enhanced learning and teaching. So I mentioned that this topic of curriculum and assessment in a DELT context was addressed in the context of a thematic peer group. What is a thematic peer group? The concept is to gather a selected group of EUA member universities. And what we did there is that we discussed and explored practices, lessons learned in organizing and implementing learning and teaching at the institutional level, but also explored what are the challenges related to the theme and strategies and policies to support innovative approaches to that, to digitalization, identify some innovative practices, and from there, on a bottom-up approach, really identify also recommendations that the group of institutions involved in the TPG could formulate, also to be shared with peer institutions across the European higher education area. So in a way, it's also fostering community building. And members of this thematic peer group for curriculum and assessment that ran in 2021 are listed here. We had 10 institutions, and we worked all together through the year until the Learning and Teaching Forum that took place in February of last year. So without further ado, I'll perhaps first introduce my speakers here who are with me. So first of all, we have Steve. I just had a change of screen all of a sudden that I have not asked. So I wonder, yeah. So first of all, we have Steve. We have Stephen Rutherford. He was the chair of our TPG on curriculum and assessment. And Steve is also institutional academic lead for professional development in learning and teaching at Cardiff University in the United Kingdom. Our second speaker with us here is Jale Günbak Hatıl. She's a PhD candidate at Boğaziçi University in Turkey, and she also works as a learning experience designer at Koç University in Turkey too. And finally, I have a third speaker with us here, that is Manuel Costa, and you're the Pro-Rector for Pedagogical Innovation, and Student Affairs at the University of Minho in Portugal. So those are our three speakers. And Steve, I think you're the one to start. And without further ado, I will let you introduce us to the topic and also to the way we worked in the TPG and the challenges and recommendations that we have identified. Steve, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Thérèse. So hello, and thank you for coming. So yeah, I would like to just introduce the TPG as a whole, and then and some of the recommendations that we developed out of the TPG, and then I'll open the floor to my two colleagues to give their reflections on these sorts of themes. So the TPG originally, as it was set up, had three major themes to it. How do we embed digitally enhanced learning and teaching in curriculum design? How do we integrate the literature on curriculum design and learning and digital technologies within that? And how can we embed digital technologies and develop assessment literacies through our sort of teaching approaches? Through the course of the TPG, we kind of realized that the second theme kind of integrated into both of them. So we really just focused on the first and the third one, and the second theme spread itself across all of the elements of the TPG. So we did a series of online meetings because of the lockdown and the pandemic. We had to have a series of virtual meetings, and this is just a little flowchart showing the different meetings that we had and the sorts of things we did. So we started by identifying a series of key themes and challenges. Then we started looking at specifically challenges associated with curriculum design, challenges then associated with assessment. Then we went out to our institutions, found examples of good practice for each of those, shared them with each other as a group, and from that we developed a series of recommendations that we put into the report at the end. So a series of key challenges that we had identified within that group are summarized here, and essentially what they summarize is, so what effective strategies do we need to adopt in order to embed digital teaching within our current curricula and our new curricula as we're designing them? And the idea that redesigning a curriculum also means rethinking the way we teach and our expectations for education across an institution as a whole. We also identified that teachers need to be better supported in planning and developing those. That's one key thing that came out of the pandemic, is the sudden switch to online teaching was a big challenge for an awful lot of both students and staff. but also that not enough attention in general is paid to the idea of integrating assessment within the curriculum. Assessment is often seen as something additional that happens at the end of it. And the final key thing is that there's an overall question of equity, both in terms of engagement of people and in terms of the resources and the facilities that people have. So we can really sort of focus down on 4 key insights that came out of our discussions. The first one was that although it was a very challenging and very tragic time over the past 2 years, actually a lot of good things came out of the COVID pandemic in educational terms, in terms of people adopting new technologies, adopting new ways of teaching, and just stopping and thinking again about the way that we teach. So how do we then keep the good elements that came out of that and move them forwards? The key thing is that training and support needs to be effective, and that we need to change minds and change cultures as well as change practices in order for those to be embedded. We also emphasize that education and the student experience needs to be valued as a very serious matter in universities, on an equal par, arguably higher than research is. And that actively involving students in that process as partners, not just as recipients of a product, is a really, really powerful thing to do. So the actual report itself focused on 5 key recommendations, 3 of them to do with curriculum, 2 of them to do with assessment. And the report is in the handout section of this webinar at the moment. You can browse at your leisure. What we tried to do is identify recommendations and some key factors associated with that. And then we also provided some case study examples of practice from the different partner institutions. We can see the 5 different recommendations here. I won't go through them in detail because I'm going to go through each one step by step, and I'm going to pause after the first 3 for my colleagues to discuss the impact upon them and their institutions. So the first recommendation was something that really went across all of the concepts and all of the elements of the recommendations from the TPG. And that's that we need to think of the question of equity right the way across the board in terms of our educational provision, our assessment provision, how we deal with students, how we encourage students to be part of our learning communities. And so all students need to be offered equal chances to gain out of the educational experiences that they're coming across. Now, this equates to a lot of work that's previously been done relating to concepts of equity in terms of students, different demographics, students' backgrounds, students with disabilities, and the idea of an inclusive curriculum that deals with all of those and includes all of those, and the idea that if you develop a curriculum that's inclusive, it benefits everyone as well as those students who might have additional needs. But also the pandemic in particular emphasized the issue of digital equity. So the ability of students to have the access to resources, the access to hardware, and the access to software that they needed in order to be competitive and to have the same sort of experience in their learning that they would do in a face-to-face environment. So we need to offer ways for students and teachers to have an impact on the curriculum as partners and as equal partners within that relationship as well. A second recommendation we made was that we need to have effective strategies within our institutions to embed digital teaching into the curriculum and coordinate that across the institution as a whole. So what seemed to happen during the course of the pandemic was there were lots of examples of good practice of people. Some people were really experienced in digital education approaches, some people less so. Some people were very open to it as an idea, some people were quite resistant to it. But there needed to be an institutional level approach to encourage people to engage with these types of teaching on the part of staff and learning on the part of the students. And there needed to be support for that to help people along that particular process. So we needed to use an evidence-based approach, and that's where that second aim of the TPG filtered in, that we need to use approaches that have been proven to work and have examples of good practice there. And we need to make it clear what's expected of both teachers teaching and of students engaging with these digital technologies as part of the learning experience. And a key thing with that is there needs to be effectively a minimal level of common understanding that everyone within each institution shares, both students and staff, in terms of how to use the technologies that we're being engaging with, how to get the best out of these sorts of resources, and how to share examples of good practice or effective practice when people find things that actually really work well. The final of those three recommendations, the first three, is that we need to support and empower teachers to experiment and innovate without too much of a fear of failure. And so there was an awful lot of experience of people developing new ways of teaching, trying new things with digital tools they'd never used before, trying new ways of assessing, trying new ways of getting students to engage with each other, to collaborate with each other. There's a lot of digital tools out there for us to use, and it's a case of us finding the right tool for the right requirement that we have within our teaching. But in order to do that, you need to take some risks. And it's generally quite a trend within higher education, I think, to be relatively risk averse because it's such a high stakes and high impact environment. But if we do that, then we stifle innovation and we don't move forward as well as we could do. And so there needs to be an underlying level of support for people to try new things. Maybe it doesn't work quite as well as it needed to the first time, but then there needs to be the support to refine that and develop that as well. And also there needs to be institutional level recognition and reward for people who are doing good teaching practice that really impacts on students and students find really, really positive. And we need to involve students in identifying that just as much as sharing good practice with staff. So those three areas were the first three sort of key features that we took out of our TPG discussions. So I'd now like to just turn over to my colleagues and see if they've got any thoughts about those ideas. And do please ask, pop any questions into the Q&A as part of that.
Thank you very much, Steve, for this first part of presentation. So now we are turning to Jale and Manuel for also your input about what obstacles and barriers perhaps you also identify. What's basically the reality of practice against these three recommendations? Who would like to start? Manuel has his microphone already on, so go ahead. And if you have questions, please go ahead in the chat box, in the Q&A box. Thank you.
Yes, I'll be happy to start. I believe my slide comes first, so that's actually better that I start. So yes, so my 5 minutes of this will be around pointing out these three recommendations in terms of maybe generally what the challenges are, and what then also offer a couple of real case, if you want to put it, things that we've done here at the University of Minho that have helped and maybe are of interest to colleagues. So about equity across the board, I would say that of the three recommendations, it's not the one that is harder for people to agree on, but it is one of the hardest for people to improve and develop. And why is that? First, because there's been traditionally a culture in which equity has been connected to support special groups of students. And so, for example, we used to have a unit to support students with special needs. And so what teachers often think is that, okay, they do their own traditional work, maybe they adapt a few things, but then they have these units to take care of the special needs. And so that's a cultural issue, because we don't want just to do teaching in a different way, to go to this or that specific population of students. We want to value the diversity. We want to make teaching and learning and assessment universal. And that's really harder for people to actually understand, because it's their own role. It's really their own role. And then there are of course, there's evidence on how to do it. And this evidence will require change. And typical changes such as, for example, why do we have all students comply them to submit their assessment projects in a written format? Why can't some students do it differently? This is very difficult to accept, because how can I compare? This will not be fair. So this is a cultural change. But if you look at the evidence, it has to do with doing what the evidence is really telling you, that this is actually something you should do. So there's also an issue of assessment literacy, if you want to put it like that, in terms of, for example, assessment. So in our experience, this is really a very difficult challenge, because actually we also do not have in our structure the unit or the staff that is devoted to this universal design of the university in terms of teaching and learning. So that's really a hard barrier. So the solutions that are slowly going on, and of course, as Steve was saying, trying and failing and learning from better, that's what we try to do, is supporting those who are actually doing something. For example, we had a colleague that she's from the literature area, and she was doing a very impressive work in terms of multimodal forms of assessment. And she was doing that in her own courses, in her own teaching. And so what we tried to do was once we have identified, for example, this colleague, we brought her to the spotlight, and we asked her to help us showcasing what she was doing. And of course, she was not comfortable, because she says, well, I'm not doing really a lot, but she was doing really a lot in terms of comparing to what other most common colleagues would be doing. And so supporting these people, the champions in the community, was something that we try to do. And it's something that it really continues to be ongoing work. Jumping to recommendation 2 on institutional strategies to embed digital DELT in our institution. I think one of the most important things that we have learned is the importance of small steps. So you could of course try to have webinars, and because we were in the pandemic, webinars, and lots of opportunities about how to change in a global perspective, so that people would go from not really very much DELT enhanced teaching to a lot of but what we try to do is do it in small steps. So creating, for example, opportunities for training that would be very short and very focused, and letting people know why they would like to attend. So what would be there that would be helping them? Just a small step. So this is something that we try to do. The other thing that we found it was very important was to create a virtuous cycle around developing of teaching and learning across the university. What do I mean by a virtuous cycle? It's not just that you're going to create sessions for people to get some training. Then you have to support those people, and then you have to support them to show what they have learned, to show what they have changed. And so we created, for example, an annual initiative that was quite successful, and it's still going on, that we call it the impact of that we have a brand, Docência Mais, the impact of Docência Mais. That's a brand of our training initiatives. And what we do in this initiative is invite those who have made changes to show what they have done, but do it in a very humble way, if you want to put it like that. The initiative is not for them to really show that they have did great achievements. That's not like presenting a paper that you have to be correct in everything that you say. It's just, I've done that, and I would like to share, and I would be glad to support and answer questions from colleagues very at the moment. A very important thing that we did, and we're still doing, was getting involved in a very highly collaborative process of developing of teaching with another university, in this case, the University of Aveiro. So we're working together for 3 years, And we are co-developing training, but this co-developing of training is also meaning that trainers are sharing with trainers, that those who are learners, teacher learners, and learning how to do things differently are sharing the same spaces, the same webinars, and nowadays, fortunately, the same physical spaces. And so there's this serendipity of exchange and people getting involved and excited with what others are doing. Finally, about supporting and empowering learners, one of the things that we believe that was really important was to bring people who are doing really good initiatives and innovative initiatives on teaching and learning to the Teaching and Learning Center. So they were not just teachers who were doing things at their own schools, but they were brought, and so they are part of the Teaching and Learning Center nowadays. So we meet regularly on a weekly basis, we exchange, we discuss what we want to do, and that was also very important. And the other thing that we did differently, and that is very important, is to bring all voices to the table. So gradually, we have brought students to participate in designing, in planning. We have merged what was called the Educational Support Group, where people from educational technologies were, with the teaching and learning people, and they are now working together. And so eliminating these silos is also part of the process of getting to the digitalization, if you want to put it like that, because those people that are the users, the students, the teachers, and those people who know about how to do it, the educational technologies and the trainers are now working together. And I'll stop now.
Thank you very much, Manuel, for your input. I'll handle the floor to Jale now, and after that we'll take a few questions, and there are quite a few already. So Jale, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I will try to make comments from the student's perspective. For the first recommendation, as thinking of equity across the board, I think of two variables in this context as participation and learning tasks. For the participation, actually, I only experience online learning opportunities. So I think of the balance between synchronous and asynchronous alternatives to communicate ideas and to ask questions. Actually, some students benefit from flexibility to attend online classes, but some of them have some difficulties to engage in virtual discussions. So maybe we can create some opportunities to share their ideas via using the learning management systems or discussion boards to share their questions. And in this way, all peers and instructors can have some awareness of others' ideas, and the class discussions will be more inclusive and equitable for each student, I think. From the learning tasks perspective, as it is mentioned previously, flexibility for the output is very important because some students express themselves in a written way more easily, but others may prefer to express themselves verbally as making presentations or designing something. So we should provide some opportunity to create this flexibility, I think. Also, it is also possible to differentiate the steps to reach the learning outcome. For example, for graduate students, we have a learning outcome like designing a research process, but it is a big learning outcome. Maybe we should give some place for differentiating the steps to reach these learning outcomes, so it will help students to increase creativity for their products. Also, if it is possible, maybe we can differentiate the timeline based on students' needs, because self-regulation process might be different in this kind of flexible environment. For the second recommendation, as effective institutional strategies, I also agree that small steps is expected in this process. So we should be in the ongoing evaluation and innovation process based on the experiences of instructors and students especially for emergency remote teaching period. So we should think of the experiences for each semester and give decisions for these processes. And we mentioned about the flexibility about attending classes as hybrid learning or online learning and face-to-face learning. But I think students need to create a routine to use these digital tools also to reduce their cognitive load. For example, if we use different tools and resources for each courses, like for communication, different tool, and for collaboration, different tool, it might create some cognitive load to use access to these digital tools. So maybe we can decide a consistent tool for each purposes, for specific purposes, to support students' self-regulation process in the learning. And finally, for the training part, yes, training is very important for the teachers to innovate in digital education, but I think students also need some improvement in their digital skills to reach the holistic perspective for the digital education. Actually, we know that students are digital citizens in nowadays, but they do not. They might not actually able to use their digital skills for academic purposes. So I think teaching and learning centers can support students for some basic skills for using digital tools, like reading for academic writing, or to prepare some effective presentations, or maybe we can provide some peer learning opportunities or scaffolding to improve these skills so that we can reach this innovation from more holistic way. Yes, these are my comments for these 3 recommendations.
Thank you very much, Jale. So several interesting points already made by our speakers so far. And apparently this has triggered some reflection also in the audience, because we actually have received quite a few questions. From what I can see in the Q&A box, a few of these questions actually already address the 2 last recommendations that will come after this round, which are about assessment. So I will keep those questions perhaps to be discussed at a later stage. Perhaps we can take 2 or 3 questions already, if my speakers agree. The first one seems to be, how could an institutional strategy look like to be effective in embedding digital teaching into the curriculum? So also related to the recommendation 2, but not only, considering that teaching in person is possible again. So it also raises the overall question of, if I can say so, the added value or the increased value or the other value of on-site teaching, online teaching, and perhaps also in between those blended and hybrid modes, etc. So who would like to answer that? Okay, somebody has to make a sign. Yes, Steve. Okay, Steve, like? And then Manuel.
I didn't want muscle
Steve, let's go ahead.
Yeah, so I think the key with that is identifying things that enable the students and empower the students to have more interaction and have more engagement with the teaching activities. So just a very simple example in my own teaching is using an online technology. We use Mentimeter to provide students the opportunity to ask questions during a lecture. So I teach a class of 500 students. No student is going to put their hand up to ask me a question. But if you provide them with a relatively anonymous digital means of doing that, then they actually ask really, really good, really insightful questions. And I found when I was teaching online, I'd sometimes have 15, 20 minutes worth of questions at the end of a lecture, whereas it was face-to-face, I wouldn't get any. So embedding things like that into our teaching, providing students with the opportunity to engage with us and interact with us, either by having sort of little quizzes or reinforcement activities, or using a more flipped classroom type of an approach, is a way of embedding those digital things, even if we go back to a face-to-face medium. But I think the institutional strategy, personally, I would say, should be more about using the face-to-face time to reinforce ideas and develop ideas, and relying on digital means to do a lot of the more mundane information delivery part of the activities in a sort of flipped classroom type of a way.
Thank you very much, Manuel. You wanted to add something?
Absolutely. So I would say that's a very difficult and therefore a very interesting challenge that we have before us. It all comes also to the point that we must be able to make mistakes, and we must be empathetic, because we're not going to do it right on the first time. But to offer you some clearer answers, I think, as Steve was also pointing out, the purposefulness of how we use time with students must be clarified in our minds, in students' minds, in the senior management minds. So what is teaching in campus for? Do we just offer classes that have the same purpose, regardless of if they are on this or another topic? or regardless of the course that we're talking about, I think students will want to actually attend classes more if they understand the purposefulness of the class. So that's something that is very important to this equation, in my opinion. There were a number of teachers, I think pretty much everywhere, that were all using the strategies like Steve just mentioned before the pandemic. I know a really great handful of them. So the answer for me is really supporting those teachers and developing new communities. I think the university as is itself is a system, and there are of course silos and networks within that university system. We do need to network these people that are already doing this quite well, because they have the power to actually attract in a snowball approach, and they are on the ground, so they know the difficulties, they know the challenges, they know what needs to be changed, they know how to interact with students in a certain way. Often they have students on board already. And so I think we should be focusing really on developing these communities of practice, if you want to call them this way, of teachers that are already doing that. And of course, doing this also means that we are going to share more, that we're going to have more sharing of things that have worked. They're not perfect, but have worked. And I think that's very key, so that other teachers who might not be too willing or too confident or too available for change. And this is our experience here at the University of Minho.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Jale, would you like to add something on that question of strategy specifically?
I totally agree what they said. I think sharing experiences and creating some communities is important strategy to take some steps in the progress. I totally agree. All
right. Thank you. I just would like to read out perhaps two comments that came from the chat box. One is from Tim McIntyre-Batty. Hello, Tim, from Bournemouth University, who says the equity concept is critical, but we introduce inequity if we do not provide a common minimum threshold expectation for delivery and support for digital mixed pedagogies across the institution, indeed. And I think in that regard, what we discussed for equity across the board was about also means to lead to this minimum threshold expectation, to the expected outcomes, and how equity could be reached in that regard. The second comment, and I will link it again to a question after that, it's from Alistair Krillman. Hello, Alistair. Vital to remember that new pedagogical strategies must be explained to students, and they need time to adapt. My students enjoy traditional teaching because it focuses on information transfer. This is something we have heard actually already several times from the students who engage with us in learning and teaching activities, that actually there is also a challenge in active pedagogies or student-centered learning, in making students themselves student-centered. And in that regard, I have a question in the chat box that says, it's from Tim again. Student engagement patterns in person and through learning platforms, analytics for supporting academic development and engagement. Did we discuss that in the TPG? So analytics and engagement patterns for students, and how this actually contributes to perhaps shape a better view on equity across the board, on how to engage into curriculum. Somebody would like to answer to that very, very briefly?
Yeah, we did discuss the concept of engagement and the challenge that you have in encouraging students to engage, especially in an online space. I don't think we discussed learning and analytics and the use of those as part of the a suite of opportunities to measure student engagement and develop. They're an interesting idea. They are useful in some ways. They're also potentially problematic in others. Yeah, It's certainly something to be considered of using learning analytics to identify areas where students are engaging, areas where they're not, students that are engaging, and students that are falling behind or not engaging with the activities. So using them as a means of identifying students that need help or more support, I think there's really a lot to be said for learning analytics with that. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve. So would you like to add something, Manuel? I see
very quickly.
Yes, very quickly.
Just a word of caution on my side about the over-reliance on the learning analytics. I think a lot can be done without learning analytics that it's not being done. I took part in a study some years ago about teachers who used to systematically in every class try to record how students engaged in class and how the department level that was analyzed to identify the students that were needing more support. And that was before the word learning analytics exists. And it was teachers in the relation with their students that were using the same sort of, getting data, if you want to put it like that, getting data to improve student learning and student engagement. So maybe I fear that might be an over-reliance on the promise of learning analytics in a way.
Okay, so a warning that to be used with care, let's say, or to be used on purpose, at least. All right, I'm afraid we have to move to the two final recommendations because otherwise we'll never get there. So I'll handle the floor back to Steve. Just be aware that there are quite a few questions related to assessment that will come after this round. So Steve, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So I'll be quite brief with these, so we can have more time for discussion. But the fourth recommendation was that we need to acknowledge that that assessment is an integral part of the learning process. So changing our ideas from assessment of learning to assessment for learning or assessment as learning. So assessment forms part of the ongoing learning process that students undertake. And so building in the design of the assessment as we're designing the curriculum is a key element of that, and making sure that where possible our assessments are authentic assessments that are relevant to the students once they finish their course, and we're not training them to do something arguably, for example, an essay writing that they will never ever do again in their life once they finish university. So trying to focus our assessments as learning activities as well as evaluation activities. And then the very final recommendation was that we really need to think about assessment literacy as a concept and training both students and staff in understanding what assessment is, what it's there for, what you can get from it, what benefit it can give you to the learning process, and to try and increase the active role of students in developing and revising our assessments to make them more student-centered, to make sure that the criteria we write are understandable by the students, to make sure that the students identify the support that they need in order to do a good outcome for their assessment, as well as the support we think that they need. And to ensure that students have a degree of agency in that process so that they feel a part of the assessment, to quote a colleague of Manuel and mine, that they don't see assessment as something that is done to them. It's part of their learning process. But also a key thing with digital assessment is dealing with plagiarism and academic malpractice, and embedding right from the very beginning what academic integrity is, how to work towards being in having that integrity in your work, and building systems within our assessments that support that proactively, but also can identify where you do have plagiarism or malpractice within our assessments. So those are the two key areas relating to assessment.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think we will go for another round of commenting then with Manuel first, and as your slides are the first, and also with Jale afterwards. And then if time allows, we will try to take a few more questions to follow. So Manuel, please. So
very briefly, assessment again is one of the hardest areas to work with, because there are many traditions and many intuitions that people have because they were students. It was done to them in a certain way, and it still keeps doing it. They still keep happening. So in our experience, assessment, it's been something that we've been working on in terms of faculty development, but we've recently decided that we have to have a very special focus on assessment and a way to design faculty training that is transformative. So we have this initiative of, let's say, 2.5 days in which people come in and then they are invited to transform their teaching. We're now setting up a specific one for assessment, because that's really critical. People really hear about what they can do to change their assessments, but they are very resistant to that change. So that's a very big challenge in our experience. So we have to also keep, for example, that regulations in my university and in many places, for example, demands teachers to write how will they, the methods they will use to assess summatively their students, but do not actually invite students or teachers to write down what they will be using to promote learning, like in assessment for learning. What type of feedback are they planning to give? When and how? It's not happening in the regulation, so we have to do work on that as well. On the last recommendation, training teachers and students. So for one of the things that we found was very, 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 very important for us was we quickly found out that within the University of Minho, there was absolutely not the place that we have expertise in teacher training in all the areas that we need that expertise. So this interinstitutional way of acting was very critical for us. So finding peer universities, finding peer institutions that are able to work with us and exchange trainers and training, and so that we can do it in a more complete and a more consolidated way. And again, the co-design part. On training teachers and students, both students and teachers need to improve their assessment literacy, and getting them part of the co-design process of the training initiatives is also a very important element of learning from one to another. And then, of course, what comes out as the training is much more, let's say, fit for purpose to when other colleagues attend, than if it was just, delivered by a center of teaching and learning, for example, with no co-design whatsoever. So the two suggestions that I really have is really the co-design, and in terms of training on assessment, to really think of training sessions that are transformative and have this coaching part embedded in it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I'll pass the floor to Jale as well.
Thank you. For the fourth recommendation, I also indicate that assessment should be a kind of learning opportunity to identify students' needs and experiences and skills. And in this way, we can support students to develop their academic and critical thinking skills, and to keep students on track to reach course learning outcomes through scaffolding. Actually, we can integrate reflection, collaboration, and communication and self-evaluation processes, this assessment as learning process, and it would help students to lower their anxiety compared to the only using summative assessment methods. For example, in one of my courses, we are starting the learning process before the session as writing a reflection on the materials and engaging in asynchronous discussions on emerging questions and ideas, and also we are working on providing peer feedback. In this way, we are reflecting on our own understanding, and also with collaboration, we have an opportunity to perspective making and taking to evaluate our own understanding. So it's a kind of learning process, but it is a part of the assessment approach in our learning, and it is beneficial for me, I think. And for the fifth recommendation, it is suggested that students and teachers need to be trained to develop assessment literacy. Actually, training is a very valuable opportunity for both teachers and students. But as we mentioned previously, creating learning communities that includes both instructors and the students to share their ideas and experiences and design together can be beneficial for assessment creating assessments, especially for authentic assessment to develop work-related skills, because higher education prepares students for their work-related areas. So we can try to integrate theoretical information and the practice-based learning in the courses. And digital tools can make it more easier to connect with the professional, I think. For the students, I think effective peer and self-evaluation can provide a learning opportunity for students. So we can try to create a more effective peer and self-evaluation mechanisms as creating assessment literacy among students. And also students have some expectations about the course before starting the semester. So we can try to understand their expectations and align course learning outcomes with their ongoing dialogue before at the beginning of the semester, so that it will be more clear through the term. And at the end, we always discuss that academic integrity is an important issue for especially online assessment. So we can try to create a culture to promote academic integrity as contributing students as valuing students' own contributions on their products. These are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jale. Time flies. So I think I'll try again to take perhaps one or two questions from the chat box. From the Q&A box. Sorry, apologize in advance because you have been, all of you, the audience, you have been very active in sending questions. So of course, the choice will leave some people frustrated in this regard. I also see that Steve has started answering in written, notably to some literature requests, and that is fine too. So I have a few questions related here to assessment. For example, do you think that embedding digital has led to increased stacking and concentration of assessment? And would you have any suggestions on managing it more effectively? And perhaps I can relate it to a second question, and I think the second one was to you, Manuel. From the example of your colleague that you cited before, what specific assessment was she using that can be adjusted for assessing other online courses? You see the example I'm referring to? Okay, any of you would like to answer these questions about stacking, concentration of assessment, and also specific assessment examples, basically, of assessment use?
So I can quickly start about my colleague. I think it was the one of multimodal. Okay, so her basis of work is, of course, a tool. It could be, there are many tools. She uses Padlet, and through Padlet, that's where she actually promotes several types of tasks and assignments doing a Padlet is one of its own. So having a diary, or I don't have the details, of course, with me, if it's a diary or if they have to fill it up every now and then. But then again, having that Padlet running means that she can assign peer assessment. So she can set up routines in which colleagues, student peers, are also involved in assessing other works of other colleagues, with rubrics or without rubrics. And so I would say that the tool is not really the critical element here. Any tool that can actually help assessment to be more permanent, so that there's a continuity of materials to share. And if there's a continuity of materials to share, that means that teachers, of course, but also other students can actually learn from what they have seen from their colleagues. And if they are invited to assess, they, of course, will be learning through assessment, though assessment as part of the learning process. So I'm not sure I'm answering, but I'm trying to. And I'll leave the other question for my colleagues so I don't take all the time.
Trying is already very good, I guess. Thank you very much, Manuel. Steve or Jale, would you like to add something on that question? Otherwise, I'll move on to the conclusions, because unfortunately time is running. No.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
As you wish.
Yeah.
Okay. I think, yes, it does lead to, it can lead to a bit of stacking. But one key thing that people did adopt quite broadly under the digital teaching that was done during the pandemic was the idea of course maps or module maps, where you're actually planning on a week-by-week basis. It's a standard thing you do in online courses, what you expect students to be doing this week, that week, next week, and so on. And so by adopting that process, you can really then think and plan out what you're expecting the students to do up to a particular assessment and space out those assessments. The challenge with doing things in a very digital way is we no longer have those sort of coffee room conversations where you're aware of what other people are doing. And so there's a danger of not having that cross-course or cross-module understanding of when my assessment is relative to my colleague's assessment or someone else's. So I think that's the challenge, is making sure that someone somewhere maintains that overview of when different deadlines are and what the workload of students is, and making sure that we guide students to plan their work and sort of, produce a Gantt chart type of an idea of these are the deadlines, and they need to work back from those to when they need to start assessment. But yes, it's a definite problem, or potential problem anyway.
Oh, right. Thank you very much to all, and thanks also to the audience for their interest. We have 4 minutes left, so I'm afraid, first of all, that we will exceed a bit the 3 o'clock inch, and secondly, that we'll have to move to the conclusions and future thoughts, or thoughts for the future, as we would prefer it. So who's starting here? I think it's Steve. Would you like to?
No, I think the first one's Jale.
Sorry.
Was it? I can't remember who.
Yes, go ahead, Jale. Sorry.
It is my slides. Okay, I want to point to the, yes, innovation should take small steps, and we should try to find evidences from each stakeholder's experiences to innovate in a longitudinal process. And we should have small steps, but try to be focused on improving our experiences in the long run. And I think the most important thing is creating a collaborative culture, focusing on sharing ideas and experiences and observing others' practices. Especially, it is very important to learn from others' practices for both teachers and the students. I think students can share their practices in informal environment, and also teachers, so it will improve their innovation steps. And also, I think that understanding each other's practices makes us to evaluate our own practices as perspective making. So it will help us to transform in a better way. Thank you. And I think the next slide.
Okay, it's me. So I'm just giving 5 quick lines there, but I think there's an overall picture that's what I'm going to spend some seconds at the end. So of course we need to think better on the initiatives that we are doing, and so it means that the teacher development, the faculty development, the names are not important here. They need to actually be improved, and improved does not mean only that the quality. It means also about how we see them as part of a system that promotes DELT in our university. So let me be more concrete. Are we giving these training sessions so that people get a shot of information or get a shot of knowledge and then leave? Or are we going to have these sessions as, for example, starting points for communities, starting points for coaching initiatives that we can do? And so that it's being part of the system that really matters. But improving these initiatives, of course, is very important. Another critical thing is that we do, as in my position at the senior leadership of the university for 3 years, I have learned that there are a lot of colleagues doing excellent things that I have no knowledge about before when I was in my medical school, which is my school base. So there's a lot of people that are doing good things, I'm sure, in every university, and they are, of course, feeling isolated because they also don't know about many other colleagues that are doing the same thing. So one of the ways that the system can change is if you change the networks within the system. So if you network these colleagues and if you make them part of a process that they themselves will be attractors of other colleagues and other students that will be more interested in know that, yes, this is possible, the small steps. Yes, I can do it. I think that's very, very critical. And of course, departments are often on the way. The department rules, promotions, department rules of, the way times are allocated are in the way. We have to do work on that. And that means also, of course, working on regulations and policies. And this leads me to point number 4. Also, the quality process, of course, sometimes is a challenge, because quality processes are all designed to be fit in a certain system of doing things. And if we believe that this new system that we want to have, which is more collaborative, in which sharing is more part of the process, in which the time that people spend in learning about and transforming the way that they teach and learn is a very important part, I think this also needs to be addressed. And the key message is compete less and collaborate more. There's a lot of things going on within our institutions, within our own institutions, but also outside of our own institutions, within our countries, and of course, internationally. And so I think those 5 bullet points that I leave here really mean that we might want to consider that we have to have a new system of actually thinking about how we embed digitally enhanced teaching and learning in the university that promotes more collaboration, that values that collaboration, that values the investment in these terms. And I think the mindset of having a new system will be particularly important, because we just don't want to change small pieces. We don't want to add technology. We don't want to add just another faculty development session. We want the whole process to look differently. And so that would be my main message. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will leave the concluding words to Steve Steve? Okay. For the end of this webinar. Steve, please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, I pressed the wrong button and turned my camera off rather than my microphone on. So my sort of concluding thoughts really were thinking very much so about making our assessments and curricula student-centered. So that sounds like a very obvious idea for higher education, because obviously everything we do is student-centered. But often I think we design curricula on what we think we should teach rather than what the students need to know. And so I think a key element for developing both curricula and assessments is thinking about what skills are we trying to develop in our students? What do we want them to look like when they finish their degree? How are we empowering them to be better citizens, to be better people within society once they leave university? And when I was a student, an undergraduate student, a degree was an elite qualification. Very few people had the chance to do a degree. Now it's much more commonplace. And so the stakes are much higher for the students. And it's no longer enough just to have a degree. You have to have a degree with skills and think about employability skills that are part of that as well. And so embedding those skills as core elements of our teaching and our assessment, I think, are really, really important. And so both students and the employers who are going to employ the students need to be key stakeholders in making those decisions and developing those ideas. In some cases, students will come up with ideas that are a little bit wacky and don't quite work, and that's perfectly fine. You can say, okay, that's a nice idea, but it's not practical. But getting those ideas in there is really, really powerful and a helpful thing to do. But the one key thing that I really think came out of the TPG as a whole is there's lots of wonderful practice out there and so many good things that people are doing across the board. But even, 15, 20 years after the start of Bologna, we're still not really unified as a sector across the whole European area. There's lots of fundamental different practices based in different institutions or different sectors or different cultures or different countries. And there is a lot that unifies us, but I think we need to keep talking to each other and doing things like the TPGs that the EUA provide to share those ideas and get that common understanding so that we can truly become a more universal sector. So I think that's something that's a nice take-home message from the TPG, is that benefit of understanding how people do things in other places.
Wow, that's really a good conclusion, I think, Steve. Thank you very much. And indeed, the thematic peer groups are based on this peer learning approach, but it's not directed towards us thinking all the same, but to reach a common understanding. And I think this is, in that regard, it's always a very educational experience for all who participate, after the first stage of getting introduced to each other, to really gradually grasp this idea of reaching a common understanding. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all my three speakers here, not only for this webinar, but also for their continued engagement in the TPG work in the past year. I think we will have to close now. Sorry, there is no time for any additional question or thought. So I will bring this webinar to a close. Just a last slide to show you our upcoming events. And of course, that we hope to see many of you at the end of April at the EUA annual conference in Budapest. It's taking place actually physically. So if you're already registered for that one, we'll look forward to seeing you there. And then we have other webinars coming up in the upcoming months, and you can register to all of those on the EUA website, eua.eu, of course. So thank you once again, dear participants. Thank you for your interest. I'm sorry for all the questions we had to leave unanswered, at least for now. And for today, you will find the recording of this webinar on the YouTube channel of EUA. And thank you, Jale, thank you, Manuel, and thank you, Steve, once again for this very stimulating webinar. Have a nice afternoon, everybody, and see you next time. Bye.